Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. Today we're talking to Tom Peacock-Nazil, founder and chief executive of ocean impact organisation 7 Clean Seas. The reason we're talking about oceans is the importance of nature. As you will all know, the Nature COP has recently taken place, where one of the big goals is to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2030. Now, that's going to be a bit of a struggle as it's 2024 and we're still trying to put the plans together. But one of the things that's going to be critical to the protection of nature and biodiversity is the protection of the ocean. It's central to planetary biodiversity. It's critical to the global goal. But if you actually think about the oceans, we're trying to put protections together, and roughly only 2% of open waters even have marine protection areas. Now, there's new movement, there's money coming into philanthropy, there's the High Seas Treaty. The thing that's weird about this is no one seems to be talking about what goes into the ocean. So we talk a lot about protecting it. It doesn't stop plastic flowing in from the rivers. It doesn't stop rubbish just getting, you've all heard, I'm sure, about the Great Pacific Garbage I can't even say it. Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's a huge stretch of waters which is just whirling with rubbish and plastic. There's an estimated 1.7 million tons goes into the seas every year. It kills animals, it smothers coral reefs, it breaks down into micro and nano-sized particles. Let's not forget, was it last year that I think they found nanoparticles of plastic in the human bloodstream? What Tom is doing is trying to address that problem. So, Tom, could you introduce yourself and 7 Clean Seas and what you do?
Hi, Felicia. Thank you for having me. First of all, my name is Tom, and I'm the founder and CEO of an ocean impact organization called 7 Clean Seas. So when it started, the vision was very clear, and it was very easy for me to answer this question of exactly who we are and what do we do, because our kind of goal was to build projects at scale that stop plastic leaking into the ocean, as well as collect plastic from marine ecosystems at the same time. Now, as we've been on this journey over the last 6.5 years, we've got to the point where the scope of our organization's kind of influence has expanded, happily so. I'm very proud to say that we have 3 ocean impact projects across 2 different countries, across Indonesia and Thailand, areas where plastic leakage is perhaps the most pervasive. And we've got over 106 formalized collectors who are working for us 5 days a week, social security, long-term contracts, living wages, and they are collecting huge amounts of waste from the ocean every single day. So that's about 250 tons every single month that we're collecting. Now, on this journey, we realized that plastic flowing into the ocean and stopping that and mitigating it and collecting it is extremely important. But the other side of the coin is production, is use of plastic on the upstream side. And whilst as an organization, we can't necessarily slow down production, sadly, the oil and gas industries and petrostates have their agendas that are working very much against us on our journey for plastic-free seas. What we can do is work with organizations all around the world who are interested in measuring and reducing the amount of plastic in their products, in their supply chains, in their operations. So we've worked with the Economist Group, we've worked with FIFA World Cup, and some really big names to help them understand exactly where the plastic is in their supply chains that they're using it and how they can reduce it. So really, we are a holistic organization when it comes to trying to mitigate the use of plastic and, of course, stop and recover plastic pollution that's already in the ocean.
Now, one of the things that's fascinating about that is this idea that we have a problem that you're trying to remediate, but that actually there's a systemic issue, which is the amount of plastics that are created and are used. How exactly does plastic get into the seas? And, what is it? You're talking about helping companies measure and understand where things are in their supply chains, but what can they actually do differently?
It's a good question. And to be honest, there's a few different ways I'd like to answer this. Now, first of all, I think in your intro, you shed some light on this issue really well. You said that 1.7 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. And, sadly, you were off by almost a factor of 10. The scientific literature is suggesting that 12 to 14 million metric tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. It's a gargantuan amount, and it's causing an enormous amount of damage on a daily basis, not just to marine animals and bird life, but also to coastal communities that rely on these marine ecosystems for their living. It's estimated that 600 million people are affected negatively in coastal communities by plastic pollution. If we zoom out, these are numbers that the human brain cannot comprehend, cannot envision. Literally, when we look at plastic production from a very macro level, we're at 450 million tons of plastic being produced every single year. And we've been on this journey for a long time. And since the beginning of this journey, we've only ever successfully recycled 9% of all plastic that was ever put into the ecosystem. So that means the remaining 91% is either in a landfill, if we're very lucky, or in the ocean, or up the side of a mountain, or in a jungle, still in the environment. So we've got this systemic issue from the fact that we are just producing so much of the stuff. And then we've got the kind of the socioeconomic complexity of the whole issue when we're saying, okay, well, why are we using so much? In a country like the UK or in, more economically privileged countries, we tend to overconsume plastic, even when there are alternatives available on the market. But when we're looking at a low economically developed country like Indonesia, for example, rapidly developing, lifting literally tens of millions of people out of poverty over the last kind of 30 years, that comes with it a change in lifestyle, a change in consumption habits, and an absolute surge in the consumption of plastic, because there is also an argument for plastic that it makes life a lot better, and access to clean drinking water and food preservation and medical
and healthcare, I suppose, because there was a huge boost in plastic production during the pandemic.
Yeah, and there was nobody complaining that their mask that was going to save their life from COVID was made from plastic. So I always try to be really fair to plastic. It's very much a super material. It's incredible, and the reason it's problematic is because it's so incredibly cheap to manufacture, that we over-manufacture it to the level of 450 million metric tons a year. And then we use it in applications that it's absolutely not necessary for. We have so many, super materials to access as humanity. Let's just take carbon fiber. Your car's not made from carbon fiber, but we've had carbon fiber for the longest period of time. And your car would be so much better if it was made from carbon fiber, but it's inhibitively expensive. And that's one of the barriers that we don't have with plastic. So you've got the systemic elements, multiple of them acting at the same time, really encouraging the gross consumption and use and production of plastic. And we're looking at petrostates and petrochemical companies and oil and gas companies who are basically, they know the writings on the wall for petrol and for diesel and a lot of, internal combustion, and they're doubling down, tripling down on plastic production. So actually we're seeing a shift towards plastic, and I can't remember the exact date. I think it's by 2050, like 15% of all CO2 emissions are actually going to be from the plastic industry as well. So it then starts to strafe into the carbon issue and the global climate crisis as well. The other side of your question was really about kind of the consumption and companies and what can they do. And I wanted to really emphasize that kind of upstream juggernaut, which is causing the consumption and the production at enormous levels, because it's really important to understand that that's driven very much by, consumers on one level and companies finding their, plastic as a solution to get to their consumers, whatever their product or service is. The people in the middle, the companies in the middle are really the gatekeepers, and they have got an incredible amount of power if they use it wisely. First of all, the vast majority of companies in the world, no matter what you are, you're using plastic in your supply chain. I don't know anybody that isn't. An example of this would be the paperback Economist magazines. I love The Economist. I think they're one of the institutions when it comes to journalism, and they are world recognized for their paperbacks, and their paperbacks are distributed across all continents. They're produced in 3 different locations, and they were using different packaging formats, and it was really different in different markets due to requirements from that specific geography, whether it's, the stamp, what kind of stamp and where does that stamp go? And is that going to cover the logo and various other things? There's so many of these like little nuances that can drive a decision when it comes to packaging. And what they had actually was that the US markets using very little single-use plastic in their packaging, but the European markets and the UK market being quite high. And, we did a big analysis for them 2 years ago where we dived into their supply chain. That allowed us to, give them a load of data. We can't tell them how to reduce. They know their business better than anyone, but we can show them their plastic data in a high resolution that allows them to go away and make decisions. And 2 years later, lo and behold, they came back and we were chatting to them this year, and they released their sustainability report for 2024. And on page 28 or 29, there's a 2-page spread about they've been able to use the work that we did, along with internal efforts, of course, to make a 50% reduction in the plastic throughout their supply chain. So a huge...
That's incredible.
It is genuinely incredible. We also, as an organization, have never seen a success story quite like that, a 50% internal reduction. So we're in a tricky spot. I started 7 Clean Seas to build projects that clean the ocean because I just genuinely love the ocean. I grew up in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, far away from the ocean, but I'm half Malaysian, and I've been coming over to Asia my entire life, and I moved here in 2013 for good. And here I am, building projects, hiring people, physically cleaning marine protected areas. And it was just so clear that wasn't the only way. That wasn't the only strategy we could use if we wanted to be successful. So we had to, improvise and grow and learn new skills and really strategize so that now we really, our whole identity is we clean the ocean, but we do that by physically cleaning it and also helping organizations around the world take upstream action. All of it generates funding, which we're then putting back into ocean conservation projects that are cleaning plastic.
Now, you see, that's something that really interests me because we've talked about the fact that this is a systemic problem. And we've talked about the fact that part of the problem is plastic's really cheap and other things are really expensive. So is the solution to the problem one of more funding towards the protection of the ocean? Is it new technologies and materials, or is it actually changing consumption patterns?
So the reality is it's all 3 of those things. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be all 3 of those things. We wouldn't need to fund cleanup and ocean conservation because it wouldn't be an issue. A big problem is that the materials that are produced and the products that are designed and the packaging that we choose to put them in have not taken circularity into consideration at the design phase. So it's a failure of the systemic system of consumerism and capitalism, as you may, at the very first step at that design phase. We're producing things and putting them into the economy knowing that they cannot be captured and recycled. We know that recycling alone isn't going to fix this problem. Yeah, it's a piece of the puzzle, and it's, maybe we can get up to 25% globally. Wow, it's an important piece, but it's certainly not going to fix it. We need to turn the tap off. And, the one way to quickly, because we're not instantly going to find new replacement materials. That's a technological breakthrough and advancement that needs to happen. So we need time to get there. So one of the quick things we can do, apart from regulating the use of it and, the whole concept of like extended producer responsibility regulations, which is producer pays, put a tax back onto the company that's selling it into the market to spend on collection and recycling. But something way simpler we can do is just choose mono materials that we know are going, so like produce a bottle out of one type of plastic that is...
So is that what a monomaterial is? It's just one type rather than a combined type?
A water bottle has 3 types of plastic on it. And to recycle it, you've got to separate all 3. The PET, the transparent bit is the really valuable PET. The cap is HDPE. As soon as you put a color into a plastic, it becomes very low value. If you put lots of color, it becomes almost valueless.
You see, I think this is a lot of the stuff that people don't really understand, because I knew about recycling and I try to be very careful about it and not let it get into the waste stream. Let's not even get into the actual process of recycling. But I didn't realize that dependent on what your plastic looks like, it's probably a different type. And that, I suppose, then makes it more expensive to separate and recover.
Exactly. Small format plastic, so plastic that is just small, will not be recyclable in some locations. It's not really a concept. There's a reality, which is something can be technically recyclable, but it can also at the same time be economically unrecyclable. And, the UK is a great example. One council to the next council In one council, we will recycle X. The next council, we won't, because actually they've got different infrastructure setups, and to get their waste collected and transported over there, the logistics are more than the value. The whole economic model crumbles. And at the core of Seven Clean Seas really is this economic problem. We sat there at the very beginning and we were like, look, there's something broken with the equation of plastic. You've got all of these people around the world, informal collectors, choosing to go out and pick up plastic bottles and maybe food pots and a couple of other bits, but nothing else. And they're choosing to do that off their own accord. Now, there's a whole host of social malpractice behind those industries, but they're collecting it because there is a value to that material. Therefore, it ends up being back in the circular economy. A lot of the recyclers are, not great from an environmental perspective outside of, more economically developed countries. But either way, this material ends up in the environment, it gets collected, and it goes back into the circular economy because there's this value for the rest of the material. And even in many, many countries and locations, for the valuable material, the cost of aggregation to go out and find it, collect it, sort it, clean it, process it, get it to a recycler is not enough to it's not enough to justify the action. The end material, say it's a ton of, multi-lead packaging that you've aggregated and sorted and cleaned. The amount of money that it costs you to do that is more than you'll make by selling it. So the economic equation is completely broken and people just don't do it, which is why so much of the material just ends up in the environment. And that's an area that we wanted to tackle quite early on at Seven Clean Seas when we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we scale our impact? And this is really where we link the upstream action with our clients to our ambitions to clean the ocean and our ocean cleanup projects. And it's like, okay, well, how do we balance this equation? If the cost of aggregation and recycling is less than the value of the end material on a kilo for kilo or ton per ton basis, then it doesn't happen. So what we need to do is find additional value points. So what we said actually, and it wasn't us, it was actually a German fair trade condom company called Einhorn from Berlin in 2018 that called me up and they said, look, we're making our products in Malaysia. We are carbon neutral. We are only using sea freight to reduce our carbon emissions. We are topping up the salaries of the staff in the manufacturing plant. We are teaching the latex farmers about biodiversity because they're the biggest monoculture crop in the world. But we've got plastic. We need plastic. So can we pay you to go remove a ton of plastic from the ocean on our behalf? And that triggered something in my mind back in 2018. And that was really the birth of the whole concept behind Seven Clean Seas, which is balancing this economic equation. We know that the waste management industry, from a material perspective, doesn't have the answer to making plastic more valuable. The oil and gas companies are producing more and more every year. That makes the prices cheaper. That outcompetes.
But they're trying to replace the demand for fossil fuels that seems to be falling away in certain areas.
Successfully so, sadly. And then that actually undermines the value of recycled plastic because no one wants to pay a premium for a harder to use material, which recycled plastic is. So then actually it makes recycled plastic even more unusable and recyclable from an economic perspective. So we came in and we said, look, this whole concept of companies using plastic and feeling really bad about it and trying to reduce their environmental impact across multiple fronts presents a unique opportunity, because if we can take a concept similar to but not the same as carbon credits, and we can say, okay, how do I go away and clean the ocean? I clean 100 tons. How do I then work with a certification body to certify that work has been done? And then how do I sell that impact to the companies who are using waste and trying their very best to eliminate it unsuccessfully in the modern world? How do I link those two things as plastic credits?
Yeah, I think that the word credits is always challenging because we've got this issue of carbon credits and carbon offsets, and now we've got biodiversity credits, and we're not doing biodiversity offsets because obviously that won't work because biodiversity is local and not easily fungible. But so the credits just always seems to open a can of worms. I mean, what you're talking about is effectively creating balance so that you're not creating more than you're removing somewhere. Is that right?
Kind of, yeah. So it presents an opportunity. You've got, if you zoom out from the whole thing, A plastic credit is a ton of plastic that has been removed from and or recycled from the environment. That credit has been generated a little bit like a carbon credit and then be purchased by an end user and retired so that they can take that claim. We know that the projects and the waste management need funding, multi-billion dollar, tens of billions of dollar funding gap. And all of a sudden there's all of these companies who are really trying to reduce plastic and struggling to do so. So it's a voluntary market, and it is the ability for an organization who wants to generate impact voluntarily, no one makes them do this, to say, okay, well, I will fund your project in return for the impact that you generate. I want the claim of that. Essentially, if you break down, remove the word credits, that's all it is. They're buying the impact that we're generating, they're funding that impact. When you then zoom out and you say, okay, in plastic, we have many countries, particularly European countries, the UK as well, who have these extended producer responsibility regulations in place. So if you're a plastic packaging manufacturer, or if you're, I don't know, what's a good example? If you're a company selling lots of things in plastic packaging into the UK, you are, Iceland Foods is an organization we've been working with closely for a while in the UK, and they pay extended producer responsibility taxes because they're putting out a lot of packaging in their food into the UK market. So that's what we'd class as the compulsory market. It's non-voluntary, and you tend to have your massive businesses, your Unilevers, your FMCGs, your PNGs, your supermarkets who are captured by that, and they will put a lot of money into the domestic recycling kind of scene in the UK, and that's great for the UK. We move it from, maybe, I don't know what the numbers are, but you move it from a high number of recycling to a slightly higher number for a lot of millions. What we're missing massively is the ability to fund projects and impact where the issue is the worst, and it tends to be low and middle income countries, with lacking waste management, no comprehensive kind of address to waste in general, never mind plastic. So what we're saying with the voluntary market is, let's use a real world example. Howden Group Holdings, massive insurance company based in London, global footprint. We've been working with them for 4.5 years now. They've done a lot of work around measuring their global plastic footprint as well as other elements. And they support our projects through purchasing plastic credits to make sure that they're offsetting and compensating for the amount of plastic that they use in their operations. Now, if they were captured under an EPR scheme in the UK, that would be forced upon them, and it would be spent in the UK, and it wouldn't really move the needle. But because it's a voluntary market, they're actually a plus. They're above and beyond the EPR capturement area, so to speak, and we don't have to spend it in the UK. And that's the beauty. We can take the success of more economically developed countries, and we can take the funding from a company like Howden, and we can spend it where they are desperate for funding.
And also, I suppose, where there is, I don't know how one describes it, it's not more intense, but perhaps more complex networks of biodiversity.
100%. When you're looking in, there's this, and it really upsets me that this is true, but actually, if you overlaid a diversity index over a map, and you looked at then plastic waste leakage over that map, it's not perfect, but there's a lot of alignment. The places that are the most gifted with biodiversity and natural ecosystems and marine ecosystems tend to be in low middle income countries, and they're struggling with waste management as one of their major issues. So it's a case of being able to liberate, or we always phrase it like this, we are here to basically generate revenue, generate funding from higher income countries and invest that in marine ecosystems in low and middle income countries, which allows us to essentially, really address a problem where we can create a huge amount of impact with a small amount of money. So that million, say it was £1 million, it's not without, and with any of our partners, it's not on that scale, but just like, bear with me on the story. Like, if it was £1 million that we put into the UK economy, what positive effect is that having on biodiversity on a global level? Probably nothing at all. But if we take that exact same $1 million and we spend it in a marine protected area in Indonesia or in Thailand, the benefits to biodiversity and marine ecosystems and local communities from a socioeconomic perspective as well are completely off the scale.
It does sound phenomenal. I mean, I think then one of the big questions then becomes what happens to the plastic that you take out of the ocean?
It's a really important question, because we have to also take a step back and look at the more economically developed countries like the UK. We have pitifully low recycling rates. All in all, it's always in the 20s if on a push in more economically developed countries. And we've got everything going for us. We've got EPR regulations throwing millions of pounds into this industry. We've got really competent government structures and local councils, for example, and we're still struggling to do a good job. Now, where we're operating, we've said, okay, what is the opposite of a good location from a waste management perspective? We're going to go operate there. And actually, Indonesia and Thailand are, they're vastly different in their complexity with ocean plastic pollution and plastic leakage, but they do struggle ultimately. And let's use Indonesia as an example, because this is the more challenging of the two. Now, our first ever project was in Bintan, on an island that no one in the UK will have ever heard of, close to Singapore. Beautiful little island with a 1.4 million hectare marine protected area filled with dugongs and turtles and pink dolphins. Great place. And we were collecting all of this material from the marine environment. And then we actually were hoping to be able to use it for waste to energy generation, of which the closest national one is several thousand kilometers away in Jakarta. The closest international one is 10 kilometers away in Singapore. Now, because of all of the really bad malpractice that was happening around sending waste over borders and it becoming very bad plastic pollution, the United Nations stepped in a few years ago. I'm very happy that they did, and they classified, low-grade plastic waste and sorted plastic waste under the Basel Agreement as hazardous waste, so it cannot cross boundaries. So, okay, can't get it to Singapore. Let's look at Jakarta. And then we're speaking to them in Jakarta, and actually, one of the biggest problems was the economic challenge. It was very economically unrecyclable to get it there. And then we discovered there was a regulatory limitation, because we're not able to take, just like you're not allowed to take plastic waste from one country to another easily nowadays, you're no longer allowed to do that domestically over, the equivalent of councils in Indonesia. And actually, for the first 3 years of our projects, I'll be very open. The first 2 years of our projects, all of the waste was going to a sanitary landfill. And a sanitary landfill is what we'd have in the UK. So you dig a big hole, you put a lining in it, you put dirt down, waste dirt, compress it all, take off the leachate, vent it for gas. It's a time capsule. It's an absolutely hideous solution to waste, but it's the best solution that's not in the natural environment. It's the first step on the ladder, on the waste management hierarchy, from mismanaged waste in the environment to managed waste. Humans have an eye on it and we can kind of keep it. This is all part of our certification process. Our auditors come down and visit the project every year. They go and actually audit the government landfills, which is always a funny conversation with the governments. But it's not something that we've ever been happy about. And we've always struggled to discuss openly, because there is an inherent belief that if you're cleaning the oceans, 100% of it should be being recycled.
You see, I have a real challenge with that, because one of the things that I've seen over the last few years is there's been a lot of appetite for ocean plastic shoes, ocean plastic jewelry, ocean plastic tchotchkes, whatever it might be. And don't get me wrong, I don't like the idea of a landfill, but at least you know where everything is and it's not actually strangling a turtle. But the challenge I find with that is it almost feels as if that is not engaging with the reality of the challenge being faced. And it's a sort of incremental way of saying, look, we did something really clever with it, and now you're wearing it on your feet. And I wonder, well, what happens when you decide you don't want your shoes anymore?
I know, and you've set me up perfectly. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but all of those products made from ocean plastic, that plastic was never in the ocean.
Where did it come from?
So by definition, ocean plastic is within 50 kilometers of the coastline, collected and recycled in a country that has high levels of plastic leakage. So what this means is the vast majority of this material, I'm not saying nothing, maybe 1%, maybe 5% on a push. The vast majority of that material was just collected as usual, BAU, and processed by a recycler that's been there for 30 years, BAU, just happens to be close to the coastline and can claim ocean plastic pollution. If we look at...
Okay, that's depressing for everyone who bought it on in the belief that they are contributing to the health of the oceans.
It's actually ocean-bound plastic. It's something I very much do support, but I very much push back on the mismarketing of it. And it creates this kind of false belief of recyclability of this material. You've never seen a shoe made from low grade or contaminated waste that's been in the ocean. You've seen a shoe that's been made from pristine plastic bottles that have been collected from resorts in the Maldives. I won't name any names of particular players in this supply chain, but and then that's been recycled into nylon and into various other things. And it is definitely something we need to encourage, but at the same time, we've got to be so careful about miscommunicating. One of our partners, really quickly on this, because it is very relevant, is in Australia. They're called Lobros Kombucha. You can buy it in the UK. We've been working with them on their not soda. They fund, it's just a removal. It's not a compensation or anything. They just want to create impact. They sell a can. They remove 34 grams of plastic from the ocean. It's like the same as 2 PET soda bottles. They got pulled into a ACCC, which is the Australian Commercial Commissioner, something or other, who had pulled together a public complaint on a brand in Australia called Moo Yogurt, MOO. Okay, so Moo have been in a lot of trouble. Well, they've been in a lot of trouble recently because they had, in big letters, ocean plastic on their containers, on their PET containers, when in fact it was ocean-bound plastic. And a member of the public wrote in a complaint to the Australian Commission, and successfully so, they decided to take action. So they were then looking around the market to look at other brands that were miscommunicating ocean-bound plastic as ocean plastic, and they did accidentally pick up Lobros. And luckily they approached everybody prior to basically properly taking formal action, and we had the opportunity to explain to them the difference between ocean plastic, ocean-bound plastic, the fact that we are not making any claims associated with the product, the material, etc., etc. And they were subsequently excluded because the communication that we have been making together is open and transparent and is very much in line with the European Union Green Claims Directive that will be coming out in a couple of years. But Moo did not, and then they got really slapped on the wrist, and they've had to send out a whole marketing campaign correcting their use of plastic, of ocean-bound plastic over ocean plastic, as well as change their wording on their bottle and make a public apology. And they've taken it really seriously in Australia, which is amazing. But then when you see football jerseys and shoes made of this same material using the same claim in other markets, it's not quite got there yet. So we've not quite got to the point where people can call out false screenwashing, ultimately, like sustainability marketing.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is one of the reasons I'm really enjoying this conversation, because one of the challenges across the board seems to be a lack of clarity, a lack of shared definitions, a lack of sort of critical thinking around what is the terminology you're using. We talk about systemic problems, and you've actually got the problem that you've got a product designer over here, you've got a marketer over here, you've got a PR person over here, you've got the operations guys over here, and no one ever seems to talk to each other. So it is a really, really challenging thing. And I think one of the things that's particularly challenging about it is there's a lot of really decent people out there trying to do their best and making honest mistakes or whatever it might be. But it's really important to have the conversations and allow people to say, no, that's a misunderstanding. I mean, don't even get me started with net zero and carbon neutral, because we'll be here for hours. I think one of the things that is worth talking about here, though, is that there are critics of the process of sort of removing plastics from the ocean saying that actually it's a distraction, that what we need to do is prevent it at source, that these kind of interventions, these philanthropic or NGO related interventions, can actually be locally disruptive. What do you think about that?
That's a very good question. And my answer probably is going to surprise you, because on a level I agree with it. Now, we need to break it down into 2 different levels. If we're talking about cleaning up the ocean, like the ocean out there on a sailing boat somewhere, complete waste of time, complete waste of money, completely harsh environment that's going to destroy everything you put in it. And again, without naming any names, if you're going to have 2 enormous vessels pulling something around, you're probably going to create more carbon emissions in weight than you are plastic collected out of the ocean. The reality is plastic in the ocean, in the outer ocean, is the last thing we should be concerned about when it comes to fixing the problem. Yes, that is ultimately the problem. That is like the best definition visually of the problem that we're trying to tackle. But it is a complete misallocation of funding and attention to go after it. I've always very much said that you can tier it three ways. It starts with community level waste management. Now, for us, we focus on coastal regions because that's where the leakage is the worst. And actually, we're operating in places where waste management just fundamentally doesn't exist. So there is no real tangible argument by anybody sat in a Western country who can put their waste in a bin and it be taken away in the morning that is not an absolutely good use of time, capital, and resource. At the same time, these communities have horrendously big negative effects from ocean plastic pollution. Whether that's fisheries, subsistence fisheries being negatively affected and them having to go further ashore to collect fish, or whether that's the plastic that's under the houses at high tide, some of it not quite getting washed away and collecting rainwater and breeding mosquitoes and leading to dengue fever and malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses. So it's so important that we're cleaning the environment and building systems, and particularly waste management systems that are going to stop plastic leakage and collect plastic from these marine ecosystems in the first place. Now, that is the starting point. That is the easiest place to do it. It is the cheapest, so it's the most cost efficient. And you also get the added benefit that you can generate huge amounts of local employment, loads of education, loads of other co-benefits with the operation that can generate more environmental protection, biodiversity protection, whatever you want to focus on. After coastal regions, rivers just make sense. Rivers will naturally transport waste from A to B, B being the ocean. And all you have to do is build some infrastructure. The infrastructure costs way more money usually than just hiring a bunch of people in a coastal community to do waste management. The river does the hard work. So the efficiency is high. Collection efficiency is high. Cost efficiency, capital efficiency, medium. When you're looking at the ocean, cost efficiency, completely non-existent. You're talking $100 million, billions of dollars to try and do this. And what you're collecting is almost negligible. If you look at the data from the Ocean Cleanup Project, their interceptors in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, I think I checked last week, it was 480 tons of plastic they've collected. Probably $100 million on a guess in terms of funding. And, we do that in 2 months with our teams on the ground in Indonesia, and it costs us a very small amount of money. So when you're thinking about capital allocation in a market that has restricted capital, it's very important that we are honest about what works financially and what doesn't work financially and all of the additional benefits that we can create. And we go in that direction. It's okay to fail. Let's fail and move into the right direction. The other side of answering the question would be the Ellen MacArthurs, who are going headstrong into don't clean anything up, don't turn the tap off. It's a very valid point. They're talking about the circular economy. We need to be moving in this direction. This is the only way to fix the problem long term. They're absolutely right. What I would say to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is that your whole concept of a circular economy is nothing more than make-believe. It is impossible to build a circular economy without waste management. If you cannot do aggregation and sorting, the whole concept of building a product for circular use and circular design is useless. You consume a circular product, a perfectly circular product in an area with no waste management like we operate, it's going in the ocean. It's not going to be picked up and put back into the economy. So I think it's very naive, this whole and/or conversation. And I think with 7 Clean Seas, you'll see that, yes, we're building projects and we're really passionate. Actually, that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I want to do all the time. But the reality is we've got to work with organizations around measurement and reduction and moving into the direction of a circular economy. Because if we don't have waste management, circular economy can't exist. And we wouldn't need a circular economy with the urgency that we need it today if that waste management was in place. I'm not saying that's not the end goal no matter what, but it's kind of the reality. So we've got to be so honest and say, look, there are agendas. Ellen MacArthur Foundation is charging a lot of money for big organizations to be a member and take them down the circularity route. On the other side, you've got, people like the Ocean Cleanup Project who are getting tens of millions of dollars in funding for a really cool project in the middle of the ocean that I just aspire to. I wish I'd come up with the idea, but it's a poison chalice because it's actually the worst thing we should be doing. And how do you actually take both of those strategies and say, to a degree, you're both right? Let's bring them together and try and implement this holistically.
But I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing, that we exist within a system that functions in a certain way. It's a bit like a fish being able to tell that it's in water. We live in it. Finance drives a lot of decision, cost benefit analysis. Politicians need cover from companies in order to implement regulation, but they want regulation before they're going to do anything. And you end up in this situation where the binary approach does seem to be a mistake because we haven't got very long. So maybe, if we're not going to have a complete revolution of everything, which seems a little bit scary and highly unlikely, then surely we do need to be using all of these different approaches, and arguing with each other about which is the right one is kind of missing the point.
Exactly. We need to work together. We need to know what our end goal is, and we need to be more macro than a circular economy or waste management. We need to just live in a world where we can move away from waste. That doesn't mean we're moving away from plastic per se. It just means that we're moving away from waste. The best thing that I think is happening at the moment is the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee. They're meeting
on the Plastics Treaty.
On the Plastics Treaty. So this legally binding international agreement on a plastics treaty. It's our first shot at taking an intergovernmental viewpoint, because if you're in a more economically developed country, you sure as heck don't understand how it works in a low to middle income country and vice versa. And actually, you're both going to make these decisions in silos that have limited effect. We can't save the world in England. It's not possible. That's just a reality. What we need to do is take a really holistic global approach that considers every different player and all of their different kind of unique scenarios. And we take this kind of internationally binding treaty and we try and move in that direction. Now, that's the best shot. The problem we've got, and again, in your intro, you were saying that by 30% protected oceans by 2030, but it's already 2024 or the end of 2024. We set ourselves goals and they're really ambitious, and we have to keep doing that. But the reality is, we are setting ourselves some pretty unachievable things. And I would only say it's unachievable because of who's at the table. And a great example would be the INC negotiations. In some negotiations, the scientists have been outnumbered by oil and gas lobbyists 3-1. How on earth are they meant to pass essentially a legally binding international agreement that is so heavily persuaded by petrostates and petrochemical companies? I don't think anyone should be here saying plastic is the devil and it needs to be eliminated, but we do need to move in the direction of or the opposite direction of where we are now, which is plastic for everything, free plastic for all, and their personal agendas just completely conflict with the reality of the world.
Yeah, I think there is something here which comes up again and again and again, no matter what you're looking at, be it human health or biodiversity or carbon emissions, which is the people with the power and the voice at the table are often the people who have the most invested in changing nothing, because they're taking a very, very short-term view and thinking, well, as long as I can make enough money to justify my job, then I don't have to worry about the future. Kind of struggle to get my head around that kind of thinking, because there's a wonderful phrase, I think it's in ancient Greek, and I will mispronounce it horribly. It's something like aphraisia, but it's a description of human inability to think about long-term benefit instead of short-term benefit. But it is that thing that we need to move beyond. So, what is it you think we need to see to move the needle from sort of politicians, from investors, from business, and from us as individuals?
I think when it comes to the issue of ocean plastic pollution and plastic pollution, we need to zoom out from our national agendas. It's very easy. The UK, we're terrible for this. We look at the problem as a UK problem. We're like, oh, we're doing really well. generating all of this revenue through EPR. We're investing it back in the UK economy. But the reality is we're just not going to fix the problems. We shouldn't be aspiring to move from 60% to 70%. In a few isolated cases, we should be aspiring to move from 10% to 40%. I'm a true believer in the saying that goes, we don't need everybody to be perfectly sustainable. We just need everybody to be a little bit sustainable, because there's so many of us that would add up to a much greater outcome. And the same goes here. I think we're held back by nationalistic viewpoints where we are tackling the problem of environmental issues in general. I think it's not just plastic pollution, it's all of them. But we're looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is a problem. How do we fix it? And we implement all of that locally. Whereas I think what we need to do is actually say, okay, well, think of it like a weighing scales. How do we balance it? We've got the most success. We've got the most capital to deploy in more economically developed countries. That should be getting deployed in the low to middle income countries as well. A little bit like this whole kind of government carbon pricing, the idea of like moving the money away from where it's barely making an impact, and that same amount of money making like almost unfathomable amounts of impact in the right allocation. So I think that's the biggest thing we can do. I think that's the one thing, if I could choose, that would move the needle. I'd say if we are able to think as a collective, if governments were able to think as a collective rather than on an individual level. On a personal level with humans, I think we need to do everything we can to live a sustainable lifestyle, but we shouldn't beat ourselves up over it. We are living in a system that's somewhat out of our control. All we can do is make a lot of noise and make sure the people that are voting, or the people at the top who have the most benefit from the system not changing, believe they're not going to be in that position of power because it's that unpopular. So that's the only real way, in my personal opinion, and that will then have a cascade of outcomes, whether that's regulation on those exact markets, or whether that's a change in strategy or a leadership role on a particular issue on the global stage. There's a lot that needs to happen, and it's easy for people. It's the same with climate. A lot of this climate anxiety is, I'm completely desensitized to ocean plastic nowadays, but it's not about freaking out when you see these problems. It's actually just celebrate the small wins. We've got to just make sure we're going in the right direction, because this is an absolute marathon, and we can't just stand there and be like, oh my God, we've got so far to go, we're never going to make it. It's more a case of actually, look at that last step we just made. That was a wicked step. That was a really good step. What's that next step we can make? Can we make another step?
Excellent. Well, I think that's the perfect note to end our conversation on, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed learning about what 7 Clean Seas is doing. And I have to say, it's brilliant to hear you talk about the things we can do, and whether that's vote or invest or what we buy or how we live. Let's just move away from waste.
Let's move away from waste. I couldn't say it better myself. Thank you so much for having me today, Felicia.